Tess asked me to do our opening talk. Often when we come to these conferences, definitions matter. And as I've tried to define discipleship over the years, it always just gets really difficult because it's a large package thing. There are a lot of aspects to it that we need to unpack. And so this is what I'm calling the quest for a definition. So join me for my quest. Go to the next slide. Because often when you'll hear people talk about discipleship, you get a couple different definitions, and I'll argue that they are all pieces of a puzzle. So when someone says, well, a disciple is a learner, I say yes, but it's also. Because the reason they get that is when you look up in your lexicon, the Greek mathetes, it says a learner. That's the definition. But it would also be kind of like saying, what is a husband? It's a married man. You're like, yeah, that's what it is, but man, if I just said, well, I'm a married man, so therefore I'm a husband, you husbands better beat me up, because that's definitely not what it means to be a husband. There's so much more to it that's involved. This is what we'd call a reductionistic argument or an etymological fallacy. It's kind of like the word nice. Does anyone know what the root of the word nice is? From Latin, the word is nescis, which means ignorant or not knowing. So when you call somebody a nice person, you mean they're ignorant, right? No, of course not. You don't mean that when you say they're a nice person, because the word has developed and evolved. But you also have the word follower. People say to be a disciple is simply to be a follower. But again, it's yes, and there's something more to it. Part of where we get this is like in Acts 24, it says that they're followers of the way. So there is some language that's justified in the New Testament about that. But it's also kind of missing some parts. What about the fact that disciples are sent out? There's a commission. Are they following again? What about the fact that if you're physically following somebody, are you a disciple? Or is it just a follower of somebody's teaching? Because if we say we're all disciples of Christ, Christ isn't physically on the earth right now. So you'd have to say that you're a follower either of his person, in the sense that you're following the Spirit, or in his doctrine and teaching. You can see how it gets a little messy, and we'd say yes, but there's more to that. Or even just taking the English word, disciple means to be one in discipline. Again, we're taking from the same original root, but being a disciple is a lot more than just being one under discipline. Otherwise, the monks would be the best disciples that there are, because you'd kind of miss the part where you need to go out into the world and share the gospel and do some other those things. And so here's what we need. We need to combine these ideas. We need to combine our powers, just like Captain Planet. Now, Captain Planet, if you don't know, is older than I am, 1990 when it first released. And it would be these superheroes, these 5 people who were delegated the task of saving the planet. You can kind of hear lots of ideology going on in there. But what was fun about the show is that their powers combined, they would make Captain Planet. He'd come save the day from whatever pollution or whatever it may be. And so when we need a definition, we need to take these aspects of discipleship and to say, how do we combine this into one short, pithy statement? So here's my attempt. Discipleship is the life-on-life process by which a person may mature into the image of Christ. You'll notice there's 2 sentences. That first one is what I would call your definition, your main thing. Don't worry if you don't write it all down now, because we're literally going to impact it the whole talk. The second sentence is trying to double click on that word process. This process includes calling, committed following, hands-on training, testing, and commissioning unto Christ-like replication. You can see the second sentence gets a little bit messier, but it's trying to unpack what we mean by we say that it's a process. And so if that's our definition, our working definition for discipleship, to be a disciple is to be in this process, or to be discipling is to help implement this in somebody else's life. This is similar to Mark Dever's definition of discipling. If you're familiar with 9 Marks and the kind of rainbow-colored books that they have, that he wrote called Discipling, he defines it as deliberately doing spiritual good to someone so that he or she might be more like Christ. You can see a similar congruence of definitions here. So as we unpack this, we're going to go just part by part and to see how this is biblically supported. Next slide. So we're going to start with the life-on-life process here. When we talk about life-on-life, the reason I had to front this into our definition so early and not just put it in the second part was because of how critical it was and when we say there's a process. If we just were to say discipleship is the process by which someone's matured, you miss kind of how this process comes about. We don't make disciples like we're printing out money or printing out paper. There's something that is tangible and a little bit even messy, organic, you could say, that comes from it. But a couple aspects of it involves explanations. Matthew 13, I love the chapter. It's the middle of the three teachings, or the five teachings of the book of Matthew. And as he brings the crowds over, he gives this parable about the sower and the seed. And the disciples come up and say, teach us this parable. And in the Samuel translation, Jesus says to his disciples, bless the socks off you guys for asking me. I'm so glad that you asked me for that, because I want to give you way more than just the explanation of this parable. Because you're my disciples and because you came to me and asked, I want to give you so much more than the crowd got. See, Jesus was testing the crowds to see who was actually going to ask for more information, who was there just to listen to nice teaching. He wanted the disciples to come to him and ask. And so as they ask questions, they get the explanation, they get the kind of unpacking of that parable. Jesus then does three more parables, and then they go into a house, and the disciples get another question, like, tell us about the ones about the wheats and the tares. And so Jesus explains it to them. And then just the disciples get three more parables. It'll say, again, he said a parable, again, he said a parable, again, he said a parable. And at the end of that chapter, he says to his disciples, do you understand? And the amazing thing is the disciples say, yes. You see, after all of this explanation and access, they get understanding. And that's part of that maturing, is that understanding that you need mentally to work through these things. We see this also is congruent with how Paul did discipleship. The book of 1 Corinthians really is just an explanation of all the letter that he had gotten, saying, now let me explain this. So chapter 7 would start, now concerning this thing about sexual immorality, here's what you need to know. Or chapter 8, now concerning meat sacrificed to idols. He starts a lot of the chapters just saying, okay, you asked me this question, here's the explanation that you need. So when we say discipleship is life on life, part of that is just the opportunity to explain things. It's also the opportunity to just have observation. I love in Luke's gospel when he calls and appoints the apostles, they don't do anything. When you're reading Matthew and Mark's gospel, he appoints the 12 and then sends them out on a mission trip right away. But in Luke, he brings them up on top of a mountain and he says, you're going to be the apostles. And then they don't do anything for a couple chapters. Because part of what they needed to do as part of the process of discipleship was just to sit down and observe, to say, you need to watch what I'm doing, and then later you'll do it, and he'll delegate that later on. But he just needed time to observe it. And this is partly why our ministries by design can't just be something that goes on forever without process and work and follow-up. We're not setting up a program that someone can read a book and then just have everything that they need to know. Ministry needs to have, it's integral to it, to have people who are involved in touch points. Go to the next slide. This is probably my favorite example of discipleship in the New Testament, or I should say of Paul's letters at this point. I'm going to go ahead and read from 1 Thessalonians 2. And you'll just hear the life on life process is just dripping off the page here. So starting at verse 7, he says, but we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you, believers. For you know, like a father with his children, we exhorted each of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. You can just hear so many of the different principles of discipleship coming off the page here. You start the idea of family-like community. He shows himself to be almost like a mother and a father and a brother all in the same passage, the different kind of relationships that he had, how dear they were to him, these people, that he labored with them. But also that he was strict like a father, where he said, I need to charge you and to encourage and call you out in those ways. He also is confronting. So like a father, he's saying, we needed to encourage you, to comfort you, and to urge you to walk worthy in this manner. That this wasn't something that Paul took lightly, that he needed to call them out and to walk this way. Confrontation. And he's also, by example, saying, we didn't want to just share the gospel with you. We wanted to share our very lives with you. That's a way higher calling than go evangelize the world and just, spout off the gospel and hope people hear it. The gospel comes with your life. It comes with saying, I lived out by example what the gospel needed to look like so that you could follow and emulate it. And also he was saying, our conduct among you is blameless, saying that when you look at us, our walk was holy and righteous and blameless, so that you would have a pattern to emulate. It's powerful to consider the example that Paul met wasn't just for his own glory, but it was saying, this is what you're supposed to have your life look like. And then finally, when we talk about discipleship happening in a family-like community, there's the idea of safety and protection. We go on the next slide. A couple different examples of protection from outside threats. So in Matthew 9, we see that the Pharisees come up to the disciples and ask, why does your master not fast like everybody else? Or why is he eating with sinners? And Jesus is the one who steps in. The kind of presumption is that the disciples might not have been able to answer. And so in order to protect them from outside threats, Jesus is the one stepping in until they're ready to do that. You also have the example of 2 John, where John the Elder writes to the lady and her children, whether that's a person or representative of the church, either way, it's saying the church is going to need to protect from outside dangers. There was people who were kind of missionaries, but proclaiming a false gospel. And so they're saying, don't let them into your door, because to be hospitable to people who are false teachers would be to share in their false message. So we need to protect from outside dangers. But we also have protection from inside. Matthew 7, famous ending of the Sermon on the Mount, says there'll be wolves that are dressed up in sheep's clothing. And what's tricky is that even them, they're not going to necessarily know they're wolves, because the next story talks about, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not do all these things, right? Prophesying miracles. I don't know about you, I haven't done any miracles lately, so if those people don't get in, right, it feels dangerous. But the point being, you will know them by their fruit. And what's the fruit is following story where it says, those who hear his words and do them is like a man who built his house on the rock. So we have to protect from both external and internal threats, as well as Jude. Jude says, I wanted to write to you another letter, but it was necessary for me to deviate from that to say, there's some threats among you. They have gone unnoticed. So when we create a family-like community or a discipleship community, life on life, it needs to be aware of threats, both internal and external, to create this. A couple examples of all this point, since this one's kind of my longest one. When we create our ministry, a question just to consider, do we have relational touch points? When we are discipling people, what are the moments in which we can say, we've shared life on life? Because if we're going to, let's say, a church setting, you can only do so much life on life in about an hour and a half church service. Most church services have very little. You can tell a lot by the health of a church if you show up and you don't greet anybody and you leave and nobody notices that you were there. Or how long does it take people to leave the building after the service is over? Some of the health of a church is, are they lingering and are they talking and sharing real life with each other? So that when you're praying for them, it isn't just an ethereal, yeah, I'm praying for that random person. It's like you're praying for a family member. I would want discipleship to be kind of like how the household runs. If it's a family-like community, how much life and things do you share with your own kids? Right? Sometimes we don't think about discipleship as just living life with one another. We think about the one-on-one heart-to-hearts that we have sharing. And parents, one-on-one heart-to-hearts with your kids happen, right? But how much more of your life is spent just doing stuff? Why did the kids go to church? Well, because mom and dad went to church. They just followed. You didn't think twice about why is my kid going to church, because that's just what kids do. So as a disciple, you just follow. You just are with them to observe, or whatever stage you're in. Or as we're discipling people, you just call them to join you in what you're doing in your life. You share your real life. I couldn't recommend more highly the book Gospel Comes with a House Key, because she encourages radical, ordinary hospitality. So the house is a mess, and we need to kind of get over the archaic form of hosting where it's just having everything perfect and nice, and just bring people to your real life. If you bring people to the polished, nice version, you kind of create nice and polished fake Christians on the outside. You got to get people into your house and say, here's where discipleship's happening. It's not just on a Sunday morning, or not just on a practice night for mime. All right, next slide. So discipleship is the life-on-life process. Oh, did I get that one already? Yeah, there you go. By which a person may mature. The maturing aspect is kind of what we're hoping for. You could say is our vision for this. It's not guaranteed, but we're saying this is part of what we call sanctification. When it is our lives becoming more and more like Christ. A couple examples of this would be Matthew 10, where it says, or I should say, before I get to there, there's two parts to this. There's the external, so things like ministry training, and the internal character, and both are critical. For the outside ministry training of the disciples, you see things like Matthew 10, where he's saying, all of these miracles and all these things that I did now are going to be delegated to the 12 disciples to go do as well. It's important that we recognize in Jesus' ministry that it is a model for us and not necessarily a mold. If it was a mold, if we were supposed to follow one-to-one everything that Jesus did in the Gospels, we should all be going out and doing miracles right now. And I want to encourage that that's not necessarily what the Gospel is teaching us. It's showing here's the pattern in which Jesus lived his life. And there's a pattern to follow. There's a model, more or less than a mold. And so rather than focusing on the fact that disciples had a miracle ministry, you could just see that the goal was to help the sick and the poor. You think James 1, the end of the chapter, starts saying this is true religion, to help widows and orphans. Like that's part of the heart and the ministry of Christ, is to go help. So part of our ministries need to go help people in need. They have ministry training that goes with that. Or in our case, in a lot of my ministries, we're sharing and proclaiming the gospel in a unique way. And that's partly why I like doing service projects with our teams, because it helps teach the values of helping those who are less fortunate or in need. Another example of this that I love is Matthew 17, where Jesus is up on the mount. He is transfigured before some of his disciples. And as he comes back down the mountain, the other disciples were out doing miracles, but they kind of messed up. The guy with a sick son comes up and says that your disciples tried to heal him, but they couldn't. And so Jesus rebukes his disciples, saying that their lack of faith was what was necessary or their faith was necessary to make this miracle happen. And part of that ministry training was not just the delegation of it, but the follow through to say, here's how you need to do these things. But more than just the external training is also the internal, the heart character. Matthew 15, we get the story of what defiles a person with the Pharisees. The Pharisees are concerned with hand-washing rituals, and Jesus is concerned with the fact that they're devouring widows' houses and stealing all their money through this process called Corban. So we show that it's not just the external things that we're concerned about, washing hands and ritualistic things, but it's the character of the thing that matters, the heart that we have. Another example of this would be Matthew 20, where he gets on the disciples who are asking for a seat of power, right, to sit at your left and right hand. And he says, no, it's to the humble that are going to, like other people seek for the glory and the power, but it's the person who is humble and looking to serve. That's who he's looking for in his kingdom. So again, the process of discipleship, this maturing, needs to be a maturing of ministry skills and character. But there's also one other critical word in this definition. May it, next slide, Banner. Very critical word that needed to happen here is the word may. Because discipleship is not a guarantee of success. One more slide, Banner. You might know this guy Judas. I picked this picture for Tim partly, but you might also recognize this guy. Judas from The Chosen. Or say what you want about it. But Judas is a perfect example of the fact that discipleship is not a guarantee of success or producing something. Christ himself discipled Judas, knowing that he'd be a son of perdition. And so when we say discipleship may produce these things, that's our hope, and we strive for it, and we're faithful to do it. But we also recognize that the expectation of it is that not all will. And that needs to be a reasonable expectation, because I know for myself, the first couple of people that I had leave the faith or walk away from the ministry, it hurt. But having an expectation of this is what was supposed to happen really changed the attitude that I had, that it wasn't about me and my ability to disciple people. It was about Christ's work ultimately, things that I had to release from my own hand. Paul also talks about different people, Hermogenes or Alexander or Demas, talking to Timothy, his own disciple, saying, man, these people, they were fellow workers with me and they fell away for the love of the world. And you can see Paul's heart in that way, but also sharing with Timothy, who's also struggling ministry now, saying, take heart, this is what we expected. So it may produce that. But nevertheless, just like the parable of the sower taught us, the word of God goes out to all fields, whatever the heart condition, and we trust the worker of the heart, God, to do his work, but we scatter seed nonetheless. All right, so discipleship is the life-on-life process by which a person may mature, next slide, into the image of Christ. This has probably become one of my favorite things to study over the last couple of years with my seminary. The image of God, the Imago Dei, is something that I don't think is talked about as the wide spectrum doctrine that it is. It comes from Genesis 1, 26 to 28, and there's a couple different views of it. One is the structural view that you're probably familiar with. It's saying that every individual person is made in the image of God. This is the thing that it's like we're made creative like him, we're logical beings like him. We see the world and act in the communicable attributes, the areas in which we act like God. This comes a little bit from Genesis 5:1, where it says that Adam made children in his image. So if Adam made children in his image and he was made in the image of God, you can see how in that way each person is made in the image of God. But there's also the functional view, and this comes from more directly in the passage where it originally originates, Genesis 1:26, where it says, "Now let us make man in our image and our likeness to have dominion." And that's the ruling and reigning, the exercising that humanity was supposed to do. And so in this view, the functional view would say that you are an image of God when you act like him or when you fulfill your purpose. Now, what's interesting is the structural view says it's in every single person by their identity, regardless of what they do. The functional view says not necessarily, saying that because we're marred, it's only when we're acting in accordance with what God would do. And yet the third view would say it's relational. And so rather than saying each individual person is made in the image of God, it's saying that y'all are made in the image of God. And we get this also from Genesis 1, where it said, he made them in the image of God. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So there's something about the image of God that's only portrayed when all of us are together, the community aspect. And you can even see this in the Trinity itself, right? The fact that there's three members, there's a fellowship. So we image God in that way. So guess which view I take? Next slide. Yes, we need to take all of them and combine them. There's a sense in which, yeah, everyone has a part of the piece. So you don't need to like chew out your pastor if he says one and not the other. It's saying, no, these are all pieces of it that we need to recognize. And why this is so critical is it shows us what's our goal. What is our goal for discipleship when we're saying that we want people to be formed in the image of Christ? Next slide. A couple examples of Christ himself. So in our salvation and how we came to know the Lord, our justification, this is when you first come to know the Lord and you are justified before him. We are made, as Paul says, new creations. And that new creation in verse 17 here of 2 Corinthians is followed up by verse 20, where it says that now then you are ambassadors. Ambassadors are representatives. So if Christ is the image of God, and now you are an ambassador and you're a new creation, it's saying that there's something new about you that wasn't true before. That before Christ, you were not representing him. You did not image him the way you should. But now as a new creation, you've been almost recreated from the first Adam's image to the second Adam, Christ. You can also see the sanctification playing out as Christ in our sanctification. Colossians 1:15, it says that he is the image of the invisible God. In other words, when we didn't know how to act like God because God is not visible, Christ himself became flesh so that you can imitate and walk and understand what God would do if he was a human, because he became one. Galatians 4 talks about how Paul is laboring and working and getting all this so that Christ may be formed in them, that they may put on Christ. But we also see that our imaging of God isn't complete until our glorification when we're with him. Romans 8 talks about how when those whom he predestined, he will form into the image of God. There's a sense in which that it's not until we reach heaven that we are truly perfect image bearers again, that we've been fully restored into what we were supposed to do. 1 Corinthians 15 likewise talks about becoming an image of God as a soteriological event. It's both true of you before Christ, right? There's a sense in which the dignity of all life comes from the fact that we're all made in the image of God, but we're all falling short of that until we are justified and sanctified to look like him so that we might represent him to others. And this is the part where I think a lot of people stop, where it gets very me-focused of here's how I image Christ and starts becoming something that's bigger than that. Next slide. Because it's not just Christ that is all of our examples. You see demonstrations of Christ and other people that are supposed to be emulated. Luke 6 is probably the weakest of the support here, but it just is a generic statement that those who are disciples act like the people they follow. And so if Paul is acting like Christ and you follow and act like Paul, you'll eventually, in a lot of ways, act like Christ. But Paul himself says in 1 Corinthians 11, imitate me. Like, that's a bold statement to say you can imitate me because I'm acting like Christ in this manner. You saw again in 1 Thessalonians 2, he said, we were holy and blameless and righteous before you so that you could follow us in our example. And he specifies, it's not just imitate me, it's imitate me as I imitate Christ. That's a very key aspect of this, that it's not just all the ways that someone lives and acts, but to the degree that they follow Christ. And that's why the scriptures are important. Philippians 3 also talks about join in following my example. And that's in contrast to what he's been talking about in Philippians 3 of all these other false people who are trying to lead you in false doctrine. So he's saying, those people are going to lead you astray, and I want you to follow my example in this way. And so ultimately, we're going to follow somebody. It might as well be a Christ-like follower so we can emulate and become like Christ in that way. So as a kind of application for this, as we finish up the first part of the definition, we need to understand, are you an image worth bearing, you could say? That my life has to be holy and blameless in order to call other people. Now that can feel really intimidating because we all know that we're all still falling short in a lot of ways. And so there's a lot of grace in this. So we're not saying you need to hit some level of perfection before you can call people. In fact, I would say that as we have disciples, their imperfections help challenge and shape you as a discipler. And so there's some ways in which you won't become Christ-like until you have a disciple yourself to teach you. It's kind of like how you don't understand a lot of things until you start having kids and raising them and realizing all the sinful natures they have. I've had a lot of recollections of childhood memories of thinking, man, I was a kid and trying to run out of my room, and my dad would have to put me back and spank me so that I can be disciplined. And now I have a 4-year-old who's trying to run out of her room at night and won't go to sleep. And it just is this cyclical of like, oh, now I understand what my dad had to go through. But I didn't appreciate that until I had a kid myself. So in a lot of ways, we won't fully image or understand God until we act like him and call people to follow. I would also encourage just practically, what are the habits that we have that we're pursuing that are worthy of emulating? You think one of the main habits that I see in Christian culture is this quiet time practice, whether it's 5 or 15 minutes. That's one of those habits that doing it in such a way becomes something that other people can emulate. I think that's partly why the practice and habit has gotten popular, reasonable for a lot of people, because they see their parents or other people doing it, where you think about the family devotion. Let me encourage something called habit stacking. This is where you don't just start something new and fail at it because it's unusual. You take whatever habit you want to do, say it's a quiet time for 5 to 10 minutes, and you attach it to something else that you're already doing. So if you're already, let's say, scrolling on your phone, or you're already going to eat dinner, there's a combining that happens of like, oh, we've sat down at the dinner table together. Let's open God's word for 5 to 10 minutes. You can see how it stacks and helps remind you of those things so that it doesn't become another arbitrary thing that you have to kind of pull all the family away to have this quiet time. Jessica and I have started, we generally have a show that we're watching, 30 or 40-minute show. And so we've started habit stacking a little devotional book. Now, Unity's young, so her attention span's short, but it's a 5-minute Bible story lesson. It's less for Jessica and I and more just saying, this is a habit that we want to get in as a family. So hopefully as the kids get older, we can go deeper in this time. But it's something small and stacked with something that we're already doing so that they can be emulated. And then next slide. Let me just encourage, the 90s brought us a lot of good things. What would Jesus do would be a great example. It kind of got a little funny, but at the end of the day, we're saying, if the goal of discipleship is to act like Christ, asking the question, what would Jesus do, is the perfect question, because we're asking, what would the perfect image of God do in this situation? So if we ask the question, not just ironically, but seriously, of saying, I don't know what to do in my life here, what would Jesus do about it? You're going to get pretty close. All right, so that's the first half. Second half, we're going to transition to a little bit more of the process part, the step-by-step, you could say. Next slide. So this process includes, notice the word includes is trying to show that it's not exhaustive, but these 5 words, I tried to encapsulate the idea. So the first step and the step throughout is calling. When you call a disciple, you are saying, you need to become more than what you are now. You don't look like Christ in this area. This is what it needs to look like. Now, you don't probably want to use that word because that can be a little bit overt, but you're trying to say, I could see potential in you that you don't have. So when we call people, we need to call people in such a way that says, you don't emulate this yet. You're not a ministry leader, a director, or whatever yet, but I want to invite you to say, what would be the journey it would take or the process it would take to get you there? Calling or giving a vision is necessary for discipleship. I love the example of the initial call for Peter in Luke 5. You can see he gives Peter 3 different commands of saying, hey, can I use your boat while I preach? Then he says, hey, can you cast your net out in the deep waters? And then the final call is saying, come become a fisher of men. But you can see a progressive nature of the call, that it was something that you asked a little bit more each time. You can also see in 1 Corinthians, the Corinthians were a horrible church, but yet he says they were called to be saints. They're called to be holy. That's their goal. And so he starts this letter off saying, if this is what we're called to, how do we get here? And so he's going to confront them with a lot of hard things throughout the whole letter. But it starts with saying, here's what you're called to. This is what it's going to look like to be with the rest of the saints and all over the world, holy and blameless before God. That's your goal, holy ones. But calling isn't just an initial process to say you need to become a disciple or you need to follow Christ. It's an ongoing one. I love the example of Matthew 16, where he's calling them to understand more than they do now. The disciples are all worried about the bread that they forgot to bring, and Jesus says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And Jesus doesn't say, no, let me explain this parable to you. Instead, he says, are you so dumb? Samuel translation again. You don't understand that I'm not talking about that, but beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. He doesn't explain it. He expects them. He calls them to understand by figuring it out themselves. Because you can see it might be appropriate for a 4-year-old to say, hey, let me explain that to you. But at some point in the person's journey, you shouldn't have to explain everything, and there's an expectation of a teenager being able to figure it out on their own, right? It's a natural process for children. It's the same for a disciple. Instead of solving all the problems of our teenagers and young adults, call them to be more like helping them figure it out. It'd be unloving to have Unity in my house when she's 40 if she hasn't chosen to move out or work, right? There's a point in which it's not appropriate. You can see this also in 1 Corinthians, where Paul's going to say so many loving things about them, and then he's going to say, you're like babies drinking milk, and I want to have you mature, and I can't do that yet because you're not there. He's confronting and calling them to be more than that. Galatians is probably a great example of Paul's willingness to even confront on paper in the letter. I mean, he opens the letter skipping the whole part where he's like, I'm so thankful for you. And he goes, who bewitched you? I don't know if that is included in your discipleship curriculum, but I keep it in my back pocket. But he also says to Peter, to his face, he was wrong. He wasn't afraid to confront other ministry leaders when they're screwed up and acting wrong. In his case, pleasing the Judaizers. Calling people and confronting them is part of how we say, there's something more that you're missing in a way you're not imaging Christ. A couple examples might be confrontation can be uncomfortable. And so there's ways in which we confront that help make it go smoother and help call people. Having things like commitment documents or having that confrontation up front doesn't change the confrontation, but it makes it so that you don't have problems later down the road that get messier. You know, the kid joins the session and they're there for a couple weeks and then starts missing. It's uncomfortable confronting 5 or 6 weeks into the session. It's a little easier saying, no, if they're going to miss because of sports for 5 weeks, this doesn't work for you joining this session. So it's still confronting. It's just doing it on the front end rather than the back end. You can also do it in just a very loving and Christ-like way where it doesn't have to be mean or vindictive or anything. People can do other activities. It's just saying, hey, this would be really helpful and good for your kid. That I think there's things here that you won't get in sports or to other activities. But if the parents decide that that's better for their kids, then we will release that and let that be their choice. But at the end of the day, confronting in such a way that says, I think there's something more. It also is what helps create a safe community, that when people mess up, confrontation can happen in a way that's uplifting and encouraging as a group. Jesus often didn't take his disciples aside to confront them, but rather there was a way he confronted them in the group that was safe, but also gave expectations for other people. You think about Peter when he said, like, no, Jesus, you shouldn't die on the cross. That's not what the plan is. He doesn't take Peter aside, which Peter did. He actually says he turns to the rest of the disciples and rebukes them openly. It's uncomfortable, but at the same time, you can see that by confronting him about his problem, it's an example for the whole community of what needs to happen. What's the expectation? All right, next point. Commitment. So as we get to commitment, I like to call these two part of the magnet train, right? We're going to go around this square, and these are like a magnet and like a piece of metal that are holding us together. Because just as I'm calling people to be more than they are, there needs to be an accompanying commitment. Otherwise, the call is useless, right? There's a level at which somebody has to sacrifice. There's an initial sacrifice and an ongoing one. The initial sacrifice, you can see in examples like calling the initial disciples. They left their father in the boat, their jobs, their family obligations, their home to follow Jesus for that season. And even after that, their whole lives. There was also an initial call of Matthew, where he had to leave his wealth, his old life behind, his sins, and safety. You think about being a tax collector, he was safe behind that booth, and he had to leave the safety of the Roman protection in order to follow Jesus. So there's an initial sacrifice, which may not look so extreme for us, but there's also an ongoing one. Luke 9, where it says you need to deny yourself and pick up your cross. That's language of saying you need to sit in the electric chair with me. This is my example. This is just one more way in which Christ is our example. He walked a road of death that produced life for us so that we might die to ourselves and produce life in other people and find new life. This is exactly what Romans 12 is talking about, right? A living sacrifice. Sacrifices are supposed to normally die. So it means that we need to live our lives in such a way that sit on the altar and choose to die to ourselves on a regular basis, saying, this is maybe what my flesh or my old desires want, but to act like a new creation in Christ looks like this. I was talking to a friend the other day just saying, and it's going to be a hard road for you, but you're going to have to choose to every day discipline yourself and die to your own desires so that you might find newness and freedom. It's not comfortable, but it's what we're called to. And there's hope for it. John 6, after all of the other, what they're called disciples, or all the other crowds leave Jesus, when Jesus says, you need to eat of my body and drink of my blood if you're going to have any part in me. Pretty hard teaching. All the crowds leave except for the 12. And Jesus says to them, aren't you going to leave me too? And Peter chimes in and says, where else would we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. So while it's painful, it's not fun to think about dying to ourselves. It's the way of true life, following our Creator and following Christ. So some examples or things that might help here would be, are there layers of commitment in our ministry? Because if you show up day one and said, okay, so now you're going to die, it's a little extreme and a little culty. So maybe we don't need to go quite so extreme. Maybe we need to say, what does it look like for a basic member to join our ministry or participate? You could think also in your churches, people are free to come in on a Sunday morning and show up to church. There's a low commitment culture, to which I think they can be discipled to some degree. But are there layers to our commitment where we say, hey, I've seen you are committed to our church. Would you consider becoming either a member or part of our ministry here? I know there's some division when it comes to what church membership is and how it functions, but I would just encourage, church membership is a great way to encourage discipleship because you know who is going to be part of the church and who's going to be serving and working. So while it can recognize be done in poor ways, I'm not encouraging that. I'm saying there's a tool that says becoming a church member is commitment for discipleship to make it happen, to say, these are the people who are serious and want to grow and are committed to the time that's necessary. Next one, hands-on training. This is the one that's kind of infamous with discipleship because it's just the basic steps of observing and being delegated. So first one, delegation. You can see that when the disciples come up to Jesus and say, hey, we need to feed all these crowds, Matthew 14, Jesus doesn't say, here's all the food. He says, you give them something to eat. He is challenging them, and he's then going to pass out the bread to them to hand out. I appreciate Matthew's emphasis on this. And if you go to John 6, it just says that Jesus passed out the food, but Matthew is clear that he's delegating to other people. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a point. Demonstration, that's what it was. So with demonstration, the first one I have is Jesus' example in prayer, Matthew 26. There's better men that have said it better than me, but if Jesus himself prayed, how much more do we need to follow in his example and pray for the help that we need in our ministry? He didn't just demonstrate it. He taught his disciples. He dragged them to the Garden of Gethsemane with him, right? The disciples didn't need to be there when Jesus was captured. It was a demonstration of this is how his life is. He's about to suffer the greatest harm that's ever done in humanity, and he wants his disciples there to pray with him as an example. What's more, you see the disciples ask and say, teach us how to pray, and so he teaches them. So there's a combination of teaching and demonstration that happens in their life. Philippians 4:6 talks about you do the things you learned and received and heard in me. That's Paul speaking, saying, here's what I demonstrated with my hands that you need to be imitators of. Or Ephesians 5, where he's imitators of God as God loved us. That when we imitate God in that way, we're imaging because Christ loved us first. Those are all demonstrations of Christ-like behavior that we emulate afterwards and that are demonstrated to our people that follow us. But more than just demonstrating it, more than just showing them, we're then going to hand it off to them. There's going to be a delegation. This is the example in Matthew 14 where there's passing out things. Disciples are the ones concerned with the crowd, but Jesus is going to make sure that they're the ones who do the ministry so that they get the hands-on training and practical things that are necessary. I, in the study for this, didn't realize how much Timothy was hand in hand with Paul's ministry. It's not like he just followed him and then was delegated into the church in Ephesus. There's so many letters where it says, and I've sent Timothy to you for a short time so that you can do this and then come back to me. That's the hands-on training if I ever heard it. Paul found Timothy and said, he's useful for ministry, so let me use him and have him do these things for me so that the ministry can multiply. Talk about commitment too. Timothy was a Greek. First, then we get to Colossians 1:1, where it says that Timothy even helped write the letters with Paul. Now, we rightly attribute them to Paul. That makes sense. But you'll often notice in a lot of his letters, it starts with Paul and Timothy, or Timothy and Sylvanus. There's a couple different people involved in the writing of the letters. So that's pretty hands-on training if they're helping, coordinate what the letter is supposed to say, which ended up being scripture. That's hands-on training, as an example. And he would go to a church and find them, and then let Timothy do the ministry, which finally, we'll talk about later, led to Timothy's more permanent placement in Ephesus, but started with these short-term tasks that went to Timothy. Another example would be if in our ministries, we'd think about where are the places that we have room for hands-on training. Often, delegation takes just more time. I know how to do something, and the other person doesn't know how to do it. And so what's limiting to our discipleship most of the time is just time. If I'm the only one that knows how to do it, how am I going to actually produce that in somebody else? You got to give more space to have maybe a little teaching time before, then you got to do the event hands-on with them, whatever level it means I'm helping them, or they're doing it, or they're helping me doing different tasks, and then a follow-up. Discipleship is tired and lengthy just because it takes time, because you've basically tripled your effort. Instead of you just doing something, it took 3 times as long. But it's like, having kids, right? Going to the store takes 3 times as long when you have kids with you, right? But when you're not just teaching them how to go to the store. Have you thought about when you bring kids with you to the store, you're also teaching them all of the things in which you're doing. You're teaching about taxes when you're buying things, right? How many have you ever gone to the store the first time as a kid and didn't realize, you counted up your money and then you get to the checkout and forgot tax, right? It's happened to a couple of us. That was a moment where my dad got to teach me, like, oh, this is taxes. This is how you calculate it, shorthand rather than pulling out a calculator. We didn't have phones with us, so it wasn't quite so easy. But you could see that there was an example set from your parents of how to calculate these things or how to make rise choices. Even if the cereal is cheaper for the sugar cereal, maybe it's worth buying the healthier one that's $1 more. You can see the values that are integrated with just going to the store, but it takes a lot longer to go with kids, I can tell you that. But it's worth it because at the end of the day, you don't want to just have adults that are acting like kids. You need the maturity of your own kids. And so similarly, when you disciple somebody, you have to just plan to take more time. All right, second to last one, testing. Next, there we go. All right, so this is the stage in which you start to see where they're at. 2 ways that you can start testing is asking questions. Examples from this in Jesus is when the disciples come up with the bread problem. He says, you give them something to eat. Jesus didn't expect them to produce bread enough to feed the 5,000 people. Rather, it was an effort for them to start thinking on themselves. So you can ask questions to produce some level of testing. He also talks to Peter in Matthew 16 that when he said, get behind me, Satan, he starts asking him questions about, does he understand these things? And the goal of that was partly not just to reveal to Peter what he didn't understand, but to the whole community. And even though it's a little bit more of a rhetorical fashion, Paul uses questions all the time. Who has bewitched you being one of them? Less so. But in Romans 2, he talks about all these questions that are trying to get you to think. He could have just said, are you who are smart and learned? Do you not, he asks them, do you not teach yourself? There's a difference when you ask, do you not teach yourself, and you're saying, you're not teaching yourself. The question provokes in you to think, oh, am I doing that? And so Paul does this by example too. Another way that we can test is doing small release. Part of why the sending of the 12 is important is because we see an example of them doing the ministry that Jesus had trained them to do. And then in Mark's gospel, it talks about how they came back to him and told him everything that they had done. There was a debriefing session. 1 Corinthians 4 also talks about the real ministry that Timothy was doing hands-on, and that he would come back to him and share the report. So he didn't just get to do the ministry and end there. It came back to Paul, and they got to debrief about it and work through those things. 1 Timothy 1:3 is his kind of final commissioning in Ephesus, and you can see his kind of defeat. But even there's a little bit of encouragement of here's what you need to do in order to grow. Testing benefits us in many ways. That when you test disciples, a lot of things are revealed, just like taking a school test. It reveals in you, the person being tested, What do I not know yet, right? We all like looking at all the percentages point, right? Do we get a 90 to 95 on our test? But hopefully you're looking at the 5% that you missed, saying, what do I not know that I need to know later? But it also reveals in the person doing the discipling, what is it that's missing that's not revealed yet? So if I delegate a task and it doesn't go right, then I can say, why didn't it go right? Maybe they did the task perfectly, but their attitude stank the whole time. So maybe they're now trained in the ministry skills, but there's some heart character that needs changed. Or vice versa, maybe their heart and the attitude was right, but they can't public speak good, right? Like there's something that needed to change. The testing, the ability to give them some room, some rope, lets people see for themselves and for you. Ultimately, when we test people, we want three things. We want to know the head, the heart, and the hands. We want to know what level of their head understanding they're missing, what level of their heart and character are missing, and what level of their ministry training skills are missing. And that testing these ways will reveal them. Just as a practical thing to consider how we might implement this, can we organize our events in such a way that creates this space for this testing? So often we're trying to be as economic as possible, right? We have this time to this time, it costs this much for the venue. Sometimes making bad financial decisions can help give the time we need. So maybe we need to pay for the venue for an extra 30 minutes so we can have time to debrief. Or maybe we need to go get food afterwards, But it's saying, here's a value we need. We need time to debrief and to test and work these things out. So let's plan for it. Let's create some space in our organization. Also, is it safe and meaningful when they do it? So if our time that we're testing and doing it isn't in a safe location, people aren't going to want to risk going out there. So maybe we need to affect the culture so that people are willing to take these steps. And lastly, don't, in your testing, just kind of sick them to the wolves. There needs to be a process to leading them up here. Testing comes later in the process. It's not the first thing. I've seen too many children's ministry programs go poorly because we just said, who's the worst teacher that's willing to do these things? Okay, we'll start you in the kids program. I'd argue that our kids programs need the best teachers, not the worst ones, right? If they're going to actually be raised in the Lord. So let's make sure that all of our kids in our church are experiencing this so that they get developed. So maybe even in our children's program, not just finding one teacher because they're willing, but maybe we find one competent teacher and one person who's not ready to be a teacher yet and pair them up to do the lesson so that they can learn the ministry of the Sunday school program. All right. Then finally, this is the point we've all been waiting for: commissioning unto Christ-like replication. Now, this is the part that makes sense to all of us. This is the Great Commission, right? Go into all the world. Favorite verse in the New Testament, for the rest of the New Testament for this would be 2 Timothy 2:2. The things you've heard from me among faithful men, teach to others who will be able to teach others also. It's not a discipleship verse. I don't know what it is. This is saying this is what expected, that there's a final commissioning that needs to happen, a release. You also see that in this release, it's not that the person releasing just goes away forever. There's still support. You think Jesus even ended the whole book of Matthew saying, and surely I'm with you always. That even in the final release, when we are sent out on our own, that Christ sent the Holy Spirit so that we would be ministered to and to do this right. 2 Timothy is a whole letter saying, Timothy, I know you're discouraged. I know that you've worked hard just like a farmer and you're not seeing the fruit. But there's a ministry support for Timothy even after he's been stationed somewhere as a pastor. I mean, I think about my own life. When I was working on this talk, who did I call with my definition or text of asking things? I called Tim. I was commissioned. I did my internship in 2014. In fact, in 2 years earlier, that 2012 or so, we were sitting in one of these cabins right over here, bunking with Tim, and he said, hey, you should come out to Pennsylvania for a while. You can see an example of a call, right? And then I went out to Pennsylvania for 2 weeks in 2013, and I realized that wasn't enough time. So I went out for another year in 2014. That was my testing, right? My working on my ministry skills. And then Tim flew out to San Diego, California, in 2015 to do a mission trip, to show me hands-on training of how to lead a mission trip, to which he debriefed with me afterwards. And even now, there's still support there when I ask him questions. I even see him talking with Hannah, who interned in 2013, debriefing, talking about things. And it's not weird because it's just like you've commissioned a child out into the world, right? What's the relationship that parents have with adult children? Hopefully it's healthy and good, right? Not always, but the idea is that there's a relationship that's commissioned. They're adults, but it's also nice when the grandkids come over and you have family time together, right? That's what it's like when you're commissioned from God. You're sent out like an adult, like a Christ-like representative, not perfect, but as an adult. And there's still a relationship with the Father and still a relationship with one another among mature people. But kind of go from this I'm discipling you moment to we are now peers while running this race together. And that's what every parent wants of their adult children, right? To feel like your best friend is your children. And that's what I would hope for all of you when you disciple people, that when you spend the time and the effort, 10, 15 years down the road, they're doing ministry that you could have never expected them to do otherwise, apart from that. And so that's one of the reasons why we do all this. Last slide. We do this out of love. I appreciated reading Mark Dever's book again, Discipling, because he didn't start with the obvious reason, obligation, right? That it's being obedient to the Great Commission. He started with the truest sense of why do we do anything? It's out of love. It's out of God's demonstration of love for us that we care about other people enough to say, it's not good enough that you just stay lost in the world. It's not good enough that you're just saved, but that you're redeemed and made back into an image bearer of God. That if we care about people, we care about them representing Christ and being delivered from all the sins, not just the final ones. But we also do this out of obedience, that I believe the Great Commission was written for us, that it's something that didn't stop with the 11 disciples, but that it was passed on and it demonstrated in Paul's life, down to Timothy, to faithful men, to now us. You're here because somebody was a faithful disciple. It's amazing to think about the chain. And so we do this out of love, out of obedience, and also it's practically just how we are part of God's image bearers. God chose to make people. He didn't have to make humans. It would have made the world a lot simpler. He chose to make people in his own image to represent and bear his image and glorify him. And in that way, when we make disciples of Christ, we are participating in a creative new creation of God, that we get the joy of working with other people and to make this happen that we wouldn't have otherwise. And then lastly, we also are sanctified by it. That there's a part of our sanctification that doesn't come until we actually get hands-on messy. Just like being a parent, you don't learn about parenthood until you have kids. You also don't learn about Christ in a certain way until you actually say, hey, come follow me in my example. Now, it's critical that we are first image bearers. So last slide, or one more. So these are just for discussion questions for you later during tonight. You have some discussion points to talk about. You're welcome to talk about anything, and I'm going to give about 5 minutes here if you have any questions or anything. But these are just for you to talk about tonight in your debriefing with your teams. If you so desire, if you have other things, that's fine. Just give you some thought to go with. If you got all that, I'll go to one last slide just so you have my contact information if you so desire. But any questions? Got about 5 minutes. I know it can feel like drinking out of a fire hose, but part of it was I'm trying to give you the breath of it. And so it's just really hard to give you the breath without all the water coming out of the fire hose. But any questions or clarifications or stones for heresy? Yeah.
So now we're pretty much done.
Yeah, you're pretty much done. Yeah, it's all gauging where the person's at. I would start with having a safe culture, right? This is like way before we ask them any questions. If the person is a performance-driven perfectionist, certain kind of tests might be more them trying to live up to expectations. So you might have to ask them or clarify that they've not done anything wrong. This is just a process of growing, right? So after the preface, I'd probably gear towards, if they're a newer member, saying, what's something very simple, very mundane that I can just see their character and their ministry training come out. So if I'm looking for character, I might ask them to do something that's more grunt worky, and I'm not just arbitrarily finding jobs, right? We're saying, here's ministry life that we're really doing. And as I approach this ministry task, let's say we're picking songs for the session or planning a service project, who's going to do these tasks? Maybe I want to see, this person's character in this. And so I pair them up with an annoying person, right? And I even preface it to them of saying, hey, I know they're an annoying person, you great, but I want you to value this person. So right, there's a preface that goes into it to help them realizing they're being tested or understanding it. And just, I would say generally, if you're discipling people, being really observant of interrelationships and how things are moving, right? If you're just generally observant with seeing, oh, those people are clicking over there and they're leaving those people out, you already have a test that happened that showed up for you. You didn't try to make clicks, it just was there. So now you go, okay, so how am I going to intervene and kind of confront the issue? You could do it directly, and sometimes that's appropriate. Sometimes it's just a couple core people you need to bring aside, like, hey, did you see that Sarah over there was, kind of feeling isolated? And that's sometimes all you need. I know with Lauren, one of the things I said to her, she wanted to be a leader on our team, but she wasn't very relational. So she just asked me, what do I need to do to become a leader? I said, well, you need to get to know the people of your team, because if you're going to shepherd them, you kind of have to know them. And so the next week, she joined the circle and was less introverted, right? So it just really depends on where the person's at. And sometimes tests just naturally happen, life of ministry.
Some of the examples of testing from Scripture are mild, and some are pretty gutsy. Sometimes his confrontations are very blunt, and sometimes he's really casting them into the deep end. But you said there's a process, right? We don't start there, but we get there. What are the things you look for knowing when it's time to be doing heavier tests or the harder pushes?
Yeah. Accomplishment for previous things, right? In a MIME team, a good member shows up on time, learns their parts, participates in Bible studies. So we're talking like, hopefully they're already doing the general call of those smaller things. But if you've already seen those accomplishments, then you need to say, okay, this person's starting to plateau, or they're just showing up, and they're a great member, but if we're going to make them a leader, or we're going to, see more Christ-like character in them, what is it that they need to be pushed in? So it's observing, it's seeing prior success in previous steps. Paul didn't give the Corinthians everything they wanted because, well, they were still in the baby phase, and so we needed to go back to some basics. So he didn't answer their questions, but before moving on, getting the fundamentals, you could say, down. Well, it's kind of like what I was saying with parenthood. There's a sense in which it's very clear who's the authority when it's parent-kid. At some point, it does move up, right? And so sometimes people will say discipleship is fellowship. And again, I would say yes, and that there's a sense in which when you're your brothers and sisters in the Lord, maturely walking in the same church and life together, yeah, you're discipling each other. And I think that's totally language that Paul uses with like Barnabas, right? There is that relational, which I would say, like, as an example of like Tim and I, we are co-pastoring, we're doing ministry separately, but on a more peer level now. But it didn't start there. And so it can feel humbling to say, will you disciple me? Or for the discipler to say, come follow me. Because it does say, I have something to offer you or to lead you in. That's not in a authoritarian way or a prideful way, but it's saying like, I want to help you get there. And here's some practical life to live life with me in order to get there. So there's a sense in which you're probably not going to go disciple Shad right now. I'd love to see that conversation. But I forget, do you have any little siblings?
Yes, sir.
How old are they? All right. 7 and 5-year-old especially. Do you think you could live your life in such a way that's an example to your little siblings? Yeah. I mean, it's kind of informal, but there's a sense in which you're already discipling them. You've probably already had that conversation of like, okay, yeah, mom and dad do this, but here's what you need to know, right? You give them the inside scoop of how to, in a sense, you're already doing it just without like the awareness of it. Now it might be scary because that means everything you do, would you say everything you do is an example that your little siblings can follow? It gets a little harder, but that's part of the call that we have, right? To say, even your little siblings, it's growing out of this immature phase of like, they're just my bratty little sibling to, no, there's somebody that's God's put in my life that I get to live the most of my life with right now to help them follow Christ.
Yes. As an encouragement, Tim was 17 when he got the vision for discipling, and he had 3 younger siblings, all 3 of which he began to disciple. Not intentionally at the beginning, but just first of all living his life so that it would resolve some of the conflicts that he always had with particularly his closest sibling.
Mm-hmm.
But over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, all of those under him became his disciples and all came into the ministry with him. And they'll all agree that it was his discipleship that led them into that. He didn't become a discipler of others before he was a disciple of his sisters, brothers.
Yeah. And I'm thankful for that because one of those sisters is my wife now. So, yeah.
Good for thought too. Like there are clear ministry settings for like the directors in charge.
Yep.
But there's also life on life happening with your family, and you don't necessarily have to. So for those of you who've not met my husband, we're extremely different in like demeanor and skill set and interest, and we're the most different people. And that plays really well for us because sometimes I'm like, you know what would Brian do? You're in charge. Like, teach me how to handle this situation. And then there have been times where he's like, no, this seems like a Hannah thing. What would you do in this situation? We've been helping each other.
Which I think that's the ideal, like, healthy church, right? Because he talks about we all are gifted differently by the Spirit ministries and callings, right? And so at the end of the day, a healthy church is one with lots of mature people who look like Christ, but been gifted and blessed in different ways to minister to each other. So you trust the evangelists to do the evangelist type ministry, and you trust the pastors to do the pastoral ministry, and you trust the administrators to do the administrative ministry, right? All of those come together in this beautiful way that you see then the body mature and glorify God in a way that's relational.
And I think there's an element where it's tempting to hide in your comfort zone and be like, that's your gifting. But it's like, well, maybe God's putting you in this place to learn from someone else.
Yeah, I'd say there's definitely like a minimal, like everyone needs to know how to share the gospel. Everyone needs to know how to disciple, right? So while there are some people who might be more pastorally gifted in discipling, right? We're all called to it, just like we're all called to do evangelism. Even though if some people are more gifted, you could say, or more natural at it, it's not an excuse for your immaturity in those ways. All right, I will pass it back to Tess. Thank you very much.